Standards have fallen since 2016. In that time, the most popular graphics card on Steam has dropped by 2 tiers. This time, 7 years ago, it was the GTX 970 that dominated the hardware survey. That was followed by the 1060, which held that podium position for what felt like forever. Now that card has itself been usurped, leaving this low TDP, almost entry-level model as the graphics card most gamers trust for their gaming needs. But in 2023, does it even come close? The nVidia GTX 1650 is, believe it or not, a current model. I know, it seems like it's been around forever, and that's because it pretty much has. The original GDDR5 model I'm testing today is almost 4 years old now, launching as a fell-swoop replacement for both the immensely popular GTX 1050 Ti and the slightly less well-regarded 1050. Based on Turing architecture but lacking the RTX functionality that is usually associated with it, the main attraction here was its efficiency. If you were on an extremely limited power budget, had limited space to work with, or weren't confident in your PC upgrading skills, there was probably a GTX 1650 to suit you. While it has been overtaken by the RX 6400 as the ideal budget small form factor GPU in the last year or so, nVidia's firm grasp on the lion's share of the market means that the 1650 remains among the most common GPUs in gaming. This became especially evident at the end of 2022 when it dislodged the venerable GTX 1060 from its position at the top of the Steam hardware survey. This, in my opinion, is not a good sign. Whatever way you look at it, this regression from the GTX 970 to 1060 to 1650 means the average PC gamer is no longer getting the same experience they once did, and it's not like games are getting any less demanding. To see if this is becoming a problem yet, I decided it was time to look at the world's new favourite GPU in some of the latest games. Sadly, I held off as long as I could, but Jedi Survivor and The Last of Us Part 1 have both been delayed. Hopefully I'll get a chance to test them out later on. In the meantime, the test platform has had a small upgrade from last year to add an extra couple of sticks of RAM, a B550 motherboard to replace the old B450, and a Ryzen 5 5600X replacing the old 5600G. The purpose of these changes was to remove any bottlenecks from memory ranks or PCIe 4.0 bandwidth, though the latter point won't be an issue here as the GTX 1650 is a Gen 3 card. It seems like 2023 is going to be the year of games that act as a moral litmus test for the people that buy them, and the latest one is Atomic Heart. It's free on Games Pass, and I'm sure some people will want to try it out given the obvious Bioshock inspiration and interesting character design, but I can understand why some people might have mixed feelings. The game is good looking enough that it might be tempting to run at the high preset, however, I think that's a touch unrealistic for the GTX 1650, as I found during the extended intro sequence. Large sections of the early game are indoors, and you might get a tolerable experience there, but outdoors you'll want to drop to medium or even low. At 1080, medium can deliver a close to 60 FPS experience in this scenario, with drops when things get hectic. Reducing the quality to low mostly resolves this and can see about a 90 FPS average. Hi-Fi Rush is another brand new title that's been getting a lot of positive attention, so hopefully it doesn't emerge that the devs like to drown kittens or funnel proceeds into North Korea or some other shit. Its art style is pretty awesome, but also seems relatively light on demanding effects and complex models. This is definitely a title in which you'll want to aim for a high frame rate, and the 1650 can deliver. At 1080 high, it achieves an average of 100 FPS, and if you want to go even faster, there are still plenty of quality levels below high to help get you there. A Plague Tale Requiem released late last year and was an early warning that games were gonna get demanding in 2023. The GTX 1650 isn't really up to snuff for playing at full 1080, so FSR is pretty much mandatory in this instance. At 1080 normal with FSR quality, it's possible to see a roughly 30 FPS average, though it's sketchy enough that I could see later sections of the game dropping to sub 30 levels. It's always a shame to suggest running a pretty game at lower quality settings, but in this instance using the low preset at FSRQ gives a more palatable 40 FPS average and can more reliably maintain a 30 plus minimum. The latest installation in the Forza Motorsport series isn't out for a few more months, so I've made the executive decision to keep Horizon 5 in my test suite, because I like it. As I'm sure we all know by now, the built-in benchmark represents a particularly demanding scenario in a built-up area with lots of cars on screen at once, so day-to-day gameplay doesn't necessarily see frames drop quite as low as this. At 1080 high the game is capable of a 60 FPS average, but that includes a fair amount of time in the low 50s. Adding FSR can help a little, though at the quality setting this isn't as big of a boost as I'd have hoped, and does still look a touch soft. If you want a 60 plus experience without FSR, dropping the preset to medium should do the job. Halo Infinite's future might be in doubt, and its player base may be dwindling. I forget where I was going with that intro. Anyway, it's a game that is particularly optimised for touring, Ampere and presumably Lovelace, and not so much on anything earlier than that. It should be no surprise then that the GTX 1650 does really rather well in Halo, at least compared to the Geforces I tested last year. 1080 low can manage a 60 FPS average in my outdoor test scene, and that's pretty representative of the kind of experience you'll have in a big team multiplayer battle. If you're sticking to the campaign, you might not feel too bad about losing a few frames, in which case the GTX 1650 can actually still manage a 50 FPS average at medium. In case you were wondering, these scores are only about 10% lower than a GTX 1070. Engine-wise, the biggest distinction between Spider-Man Remastered and Miles Morales is that the latter game has a more comprehensive set of RT features, but as the GTX 1650 lacks RT, and I lack a copy of Miles Morales, this should serve as a pretty reasonable indicator of what to expect of either game. You can get a pretty reasonable experience at 1080 high, though it's not what I'd call flawless. Averages come in above 50 FPS, but lows are almost half that, mainly due to some heavy drops when viewing the city from above. Adding FSR will help, and I was able to get close to 60 FPS at the very high preset with FSR quality, though it's a little blurry and can create some odd artifacts on distant patterns. 1080 medium is sufficient for a 60 plus average if you'd rather pass on the upscaling tech. Uncharted 4 may be an old PS4 title, but it's brand new on PC and is definitely the kind of game you'd expect the GTX 1650 to do well in. And that's where you'd be quite wrong. Well, okay, at 1080 medium, the 1650 can beat the base PS4 pretty convincingly at about 43 FPS on average, over 40% higher than the console's 30 FPS target. You might even be able to turn settings up and stay at around the 30 FPS mark, but I decided to look at this from the other direction. Adding balanced FSR allows for a 60 FPS average, though this does again look pretty soft by comparison. Concluding my Sony titles, God of War is also a game that needs some quality compromises in order to reach a 60 FPS target. The original preset gives approximately the same settings as the base PS4 would use, though the console would once more give a pretty uneven 30 FPS. The 1650 almost reaches 50 FPS without any resolution scaling, and adding some FSRQ can push that up to the 60 mark without an issue. This is FSR2, and quality isn't too bad, though there is a bit of a fuzzy halo around Kratos when you move the camera. I know Cyberpunk is getting old now, but it still sees regular updates even after more than 2 years since release, and is still many people's metric for modern demanding games. Hence why I refer to it as the modern crisis. I wouldn't normally want to play Cyberpunk below the medium preset if possible, and the 1650 can deliver a modest 30 FPS at these settings. Adding FSR quality helps make the game a bit more palatable, boosting averages to over 40 FPS. If you were wondering if 60 FPS is possible, well, almost, yeah, but not without some major sacrifices. This is 1080 low with FSR performance, and it falls just a couple of frames short of the targets. Witcher 3's new Remastered mode features modern conveniences, revamped lighting and ambient occlusion, and reworked textures, making for a much more demanding game all round. Thankfully, it also features some contemporary upscaling tech to help out players on lower spec PCs. 1080 high without upscaling is borderline unplayable at around 22 FPS, but adding the maximum quality FSR setting sends that number into the mid-30s. 60 FPS is achievable, but only by dropping to medium and reducing the FSR level to performance, and by this point you might want to consider just downgrading the game to the original version instead. Forspoken didn't get great reviews on launch and has also been reportedly quite janky on PC, hence why this is the demo and not the full game. It appears that the demo is receiving patches, however, as I was testing version 1.04, which is the latest available at the time of recording. Gameplay seems fine, and I didn't encounter any of the bugs I've seen reported elsewhere. Performance, however, is pretty dire. Like many of the AA and AAA games in this video, the GTX 1650 is far below the recommended specs, and FSR can't really save it. At standard settings, FSR quality delivers about 23 FPS and is particularly rough in combat. FSR performance almost reaches 30, but again, several effects that occur in combat can cause things to slow to a crawl. The only solution that seems to work consistently, even in large-scale combat, is 1080 low with FSR performance, and that does rather leave the game looking like trash. For all the incendiary titles that have launched lately, it's nice to try a game that's controversial for good old-fashioned reasons. Predatory monetization, a lack of respect for game preservation, and changes to a formula that the existing fanbase didn't like. Overwatch 2 completely replaces Overwatch and is now free to play. It's also not a great deal more demanding than its predecessor, so the GTX 1650 can handle it easily. At 1080 high, the GPU can manage a suitably refreshing 115 FPS. If you're dead set on hitting 144, there's plenty of room to drop quality further, but if you'd rather gaze longingly at your favourite Rule 34 characters, pushing up to Epic can still run the game above 60 FPS on average. Fortnite remains as relevant as ever, thanks mainly to its status as Epic's main sales tool for Unreal Engine. Thanks to the new revision, features like Lumen and Nanite mean that this game can take some seriously powerful hardware to run at the highest settings. Alas, that does rule out the GTX 1650. Performance tanks to below 30 FPS when Lumen and Nanite are enabled, and even turning them off, high settings only climbs to about 40 FPS, and really just serves to make the game harder to play competitively. Medium still looks pretty damn good to my eye and can also get close to a 90 FPS average. Of course, if you do want the most competitive experience, dropping to low with Epic View Distance sees FPS climb to 150. Finally, Warzone 2 from those always wholesome folks over at Activision. Following in the footsteps of its predecessor, this Call of Duty BR looks ugly as sin at anything below the ultra quality preset, so choosing between the 70 FPS of the basic preset and 65 FPS of balanced isn't quite as big of a dilemma as you might expect. It is possible to run Warzone 2 on the 1650 using the ultra preset, but only through resolution scaling. The game features Intel XeSS, which at balance can provide a fairly smooth 60 FPS average, and in my opinion, actually looks pretty damned amazing. All in all then, I'm afraid the GTX 1650 looks like a pretty poor candidate for the most popular graphics card in the world in 2023. Sure, it's more than good enough for older titles. It'll happily chew through CSGO, GTA 5 and Dota 2, even Apex Legends, but at a time where cross-platform games are made with 9th gen consoles as a point of reference, recommended and even minimum requirements are leaving this tier of GPU behind. It is capable of actually running and playing the latest games, there's no doubt about that. Turing is still officially supported by nVidia and can handle the DX12.1 feature level, but its lack of processing power and VRAM means it leans pretty heavily on upscaling tech to get even close to a playable frame rate. If you need a cheap GPU that can run without external power, you don't have that many other options, but otherwise, there are a ton of alternatives. In a couple of weeks' time, I'll be looking at an interesting candidate for a new favourite budget-used GPU, the RX 5600 XT. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.